Well, hello, good morning. Good to be with you, people of Whitford, and maybe a few people wider afield. I hope you're all well and surviving in a slightly eased off lockdown, but lockdown nonetheless. Um, we're going to begin this morning by just reading through again the Bible passage, which is from 1 Samuel 24. So, just as people come across, give them a chance both to get here and to hear the reading again. So 1 Samuel chapter 24. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, David is in the wilderness of En Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to look for David and his men in the direction of the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheepfolds beside the road, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. The men of David said to him, Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Then David went and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. Afterwards David was stricken to the heart, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do anything to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to raise my hand against him, for he is the Lord's anointed. So David scolded his men severely, and did not permit them to attack Saul. Then Saul got up and left the cave, and went on his way. Afterwards David also rose up and went out of the cave, and called after Saul, My Lord and my King. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground, and did obeisance. David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of those who say, David seeks to do you harm? This very day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in the cave. And some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not raise my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See my father, see the corner of your cloak in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your cloak and did not kill you, you may know for certain that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you are hunting me to take my life. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the ancient proverb says, out of the wickedness comes forth wickedness. But my hand shall not be against you. Against whom has the King of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog? A single flea? May the Lord therefore be judge, and give sentence between me and you. May he see to it, and plead my cause, and vindicate me against you. When David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, Is that your voice, my son David? Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. Today you have explained how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For who has ever found an enemy and sent the enemy safely away? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. Now I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not wipe out my name from my father's house. So David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. Well, good morning, everybody. Seeing a few comments popping up. Hello, Lynette, Stephen, Barbara. Lots of people. Hello, everybody. We'll be here naming you all day if we don't get on. But it's really good to see all of you. And so we're here and we're in the story of David, and I find this bit really interesting. It's a moment from David's earlier life, perhaps. We're still in 1 Samuel. You've got a whole other heap of stuff that goes on after this. David is not yet king. And I want to begin this morning, actually, not by starting with David, but I want to start with Saul, because I think if we're not careful, we can be tempted to skip straight to the character of David in this story and how brilliant he is. But actually, I think actually, if you begin looking at Saul, we get a much better contrast between the two men. And there's perhaps some warnings in this story, as well as the way in which we should act towards others in the narrative. And for me, Saul's story demonstrates just how far wrong we can go when our hearts turn away from God's purposes and we start serving our own ends. Saul has become obsessive and uh, absolutely driven to get rid of David, to kill David. Now we know from those of you who know the story, will know that his heart became hard quite a long way back in the whole picture when he found out that David would become king. Um, and actually, this very fact shone a bright spotlight on Saul's own failings and his own insecurities. Saul wasn't necessarily, he didn't start as a bad person. Saul was started well, but as he became more and more established as the king of Israel, his heart steadily turned further away from God. And rather than going towards what God wanted for his people, he became just concerned with maintaining his own status, his own kingdom. It became about building his own kingdom rather than God's kingdom. And actually, the thought of someone else coming in and being successful, it just didn't sit well with him. And actually, if you read the previous chapter, 1 Samuel 23, you'll see that Jonathan, a bit better than his father, really, in a lot of ways. In fact, he's a lot better than his father in a lot of ways. He has no problem with the idea that David would be king. He even admits that he thinks David would be a good king, and he would long to actually serve under David. But that's not enough for Saul. That admission from his own son isn't enough for him. He wants to hold on to his own kingdom for as long as possible, and is determined to do his best to avoid that which God is saying will happen. Now, that's not a great place to be. And, I think it's interesting when we begin this morning's reading, we see how far out of control he's gotten. We see in this passage that there are actually as a king and as a defender of the kingdom, there are perhaps some other things that Saul should be worrying about. The Philistines are constantly raiding the land, and he's having to go off and chase them. And, actually, I think there are probably some other things other than one man who's not even out really to get you in his own heart. There are probably some other things as a leader of a country that you should be worrying about. But instead, Saul, consumed by his own emotions and his own obsession, we see that he takes 3,000 men to go and find and defeat David, who is hiding with some men, but 3,000 men to go and find one man, probably a bit much. And we see in the reading that David he's actually in a place called Engedi, a place where he was the place where he was hiding. And I've been there, and anyone who's actually been there will tell you that in many respects you couldn't actually hide that many people in that place. It wouldn't have been anywhere near the number that Saul took up there. You wouldn't be able to march an army of that size up the hill, up the slopes to the caves where they were hiding. And yet Saul, he takes this whole army for the sake of one man. And it's just, when you think about it, it's a waste of his own resources, but actually also a demonstration of just how far off the road he's gone. And this is the warning in this morning's reading: when we've lost sight of God's purposes and actually our insecurities begin to rule our actions, we can be in danger of reacting disproportionately to the context and the situations that we find ourselves in. Now, I'm not going to for 1 second suggest, at least I hope not, that any of you has access to your own army. But I wonder how many of us in our own personal relationships, sometimes if we've been angry or something, have sought our own gain rather than actually what God would want us to do in those situations. And there can be those times when it's so tempting to let bitterness in and rule our responses to those around us who may have found more favour in God's eyes. A comical example: when I was in bands in my younger years and was playing music and stuff, you'd often find that if another group in the community local circuit found favour for no apparent reason over another, who thought they were actually better for whatever reason, you could guarantee that there would soon be some disproportionate rumours and comments about the other lot flying around the place. Quite petty when you think about it and when I look back. But actually, also in today's world, we see it a lot. We see it a lot. You think about social media and the way in which that's become a really powerful way for us to connect. But also, if we're not careful, and the way in which that can be used, it can be used as a weapon, and it can be wielded with devastating consequences. I've seen Twitter used to drum up the support of thousands of people to tear down one other person over issues that are sometimes inconsequential. Not every issue is inconsequential, but a lot of them, and I'd say probably the majority of them are. And in those situations, we can be tempted to let our hearts do all the ruling before engaging our heads. And when we come to David and we start to think about David in this reading, that's what his followers are urging him to do. They're urging him to go with his heart. They're there pressuring him to get rid of Saul. They think that the Lord has given this cruel king over to David to be rid of Saul. And we find, the centerpiece of this story really is in the gloom of this very dark cave that Saul's entered. And you could say that actually Saul has quite literally been caught with his trousers down. And, the thought must have crossed David's mind, really, that he himself has been presented with this chance to rid himself of a man who has caused a great deal of hardship. And En-Gedi, it's a tough place to hide out for a long time. It's just to give you a picture of what it's like there. It's just up the hill from the Dead Sea, and it is actually in itself quite a beautiful place. There's a series of lakes and waterfalls, but it's also the surrounding area is hot, it's dry. It is the one oasis around there. You are disconnected from so much. There's not a lot in the way of civilization. It is the only source of drinkable water supply for miles. The caves are small, it's tiny. Walking up and down the hills there is hard. And actually, for those of you who know your Psalm 42 is often attributed to David's time in hiding there. And when David writes in that psalm, as the deer pants for the water, he actually really means that, because En-Gedi has this unique species of deer and goat that live there, and actually, when they get thirsty, they make quite a horrid sound. It's quite a horrible sound of desperation for water. This place is a really hard environment to be in. If you get thirsty there, you know about it. And the man responsible for David being in this situation is right in front of him, and he's ready to be taken out. David can get rid of him there and then, sorry. But David is not like Saul. His heart is still focused on God and the way in which God wants him to do things. And instead of letting the emotion of the situation get to him, he engages his brain. He does what he thinks would be righteous in God's sight, and he spares Saul's life. Even though many among David's ranks, and perhaps even David himself, would have been tempted to think that the Lord had given Saul there and then to be killed, to be gotten rid of. But David's heart at this point in time, at least at this point in David's story, is for God's purposes and not his own gain. And actually, the one thing I love in this story is that David is distraught at the very fact that he's even had to harm Saul's cloak. He's not touched the man himself, but in cutting his clothes, he's caused himself a great deal of upset. And I think this demonstrates the difference between the two men. One is obsessed with causing harm. The other is upset that he's even had to touch the clothes of the other. And then furthermore, David retains his humility rather than rub it in Saul's face. You could misread the passage, I think, in thinking that David is taunting Saul by waving the piece of cloak at him, but he's not. He's doing it as a display of humility. He bows before Saul and calls him my Lord and my King. And he asks him why he believes the stories that he's there and out to cause Saul harm. And it's a stark reminder of just how far Saul's gone for himself. It's at this point he realizes just how crazy things have gotten. The penny drops and he's beside himself with grief over his actions. So, takeaways from this morning's reading. I'm just coming into lands, but 3 points very quickly for you. What can we learn from this morning's reading? Well, firstly, I think it's important to remember that we are to set God before us and God's purposes, and to be obedient to his will for us. And I think in life it's too easy for us to try and build our own kingdoms, to try and control things for ourselves, but ultimately we can't. It's God who's in control. Saul had the opportunity to actually build and invest in David for the future of the kingdom. He could have had the bigger picture in mind. You know, some translations they put David as a son, a future son for Saul, in a weird way, because he goes to live with Saul from a young age, and Saul could have invested in David for God's purposes, but because of his selfish desire to hold on to what he has, he ends up fighting against David, and in fighting against David ultimately fights against God's purposes. And so that begs the question for all of us: are we putting God first in our lives? Have we got God's picture in our minds? And secondly, in relation to the first point, we need to avoid the easy way out. Actually, if we're going to lead a life of following God and putting God's purposes first, that's costly. David didn't just have a chance to remove an enemy, he had a chance to return to a normal way of life. It would have been so easy for him to have struck Saul down there and then, but that's not what God wanted, and David knew that. David did what Saul couldn't do. He was obedient. But we must always remember that being obedient often comes with a cost to ourselves. And Jesus himself said that those who wished to follow him needed to count the cost of doing so. And being a follower of Jesus means that sometimes we will have to let go of our own pride for the sake of the bigger picture. And David knew this, and David followed through on this. And it's one of the key differences between the two. And thirdly and lastly, humility is important. There's the last scene in this reading that speaks of David's humility, but credit of where it's due. And actually in this passage, we can see that Saul as well shows a degree of humility. He sees the error of his ways and he admits it. And how many of us in Saul's position would have taken one look at David and sent the whole army up after him? You know, I think I would have been tempted if I was Saul and if I was in his position and if I'd have gone that far. But Saul hears God in this situation. He finally gets it, even if it's for this fleeting moment. He gets it. But he realizes just how far off track he is. He ultimately goes back down a dark path. But I do love that we see the glimpse of the man he could have been. And as they look at each other, you actually see that engagement. David says to him, "My father," and Saul looks up at him and says, "My son." And there's a moment in this story where we see them share a humble moment, and perhaps where they both realise what could have been. And humility makes that moment possible, and that's why it's important. And this morning's story calls us to be obedient. It calls us to choose that costly life, and it calls us to be humble. And perhaps that's the challenge for us this week. I'll lay those 3 things down for you to think about. How are we being obedient? Are you choosing the costly life? And are you being humble? Some things there to think about. Amen. Do stick around. Jess's video is probably already starting. It should be up very, very soon. And it was good to be with you this morning. Hopefully, we'll see some of you online soon in Zoom. And that's it from me this morning. Bye for now.